Greetings, everyone. This is your video lecture for Unit 3. And in Unit 3, we're going to be covering chapters 7 through 10. This unit is all about the structure of government, how government is structured. Chapter 7, we talk about the legislature. This is how a bill becomes law. This is where your voice is heard in Texas state government. And then in Chapter 8, we talk about the executive branch. We mentioned a little bit about the executive branch when we were talking about the Constitution. Remember, this is your plural executive, your statewide elected officials, okay, who are all responsible for different pieces and parts of governing the state. And then we're going to talk about our judicial system in Texas. You know, all states have their own judicial system. The federal judicial system is for federal crimes. The state judicial system is for state crimes. And then local governments. And local governments don't get enough attention. Local governments, I told you my grandfather was a small town mayor. Local governments, city and county governments have more of an impact on your day-to-day quality of life as far as just the day-to-day things that you need, your clean water, your safe streets, your public schools, your parks, picking up garbage, all that stuff. It's not as sexy and gains as much attention as the things that happen in the federal government. But as far as the quality of life in your community for you and your family, your city and county governments have a huge impact. And we tend to sort of sweep them aside. So we'll start with the legislature. That's the first chapter in Unit 3. And I used to work in the legislature in Texas. I was a public information aide for a state senator for a number of years. And it was the most exciting, just rewarding. I've never worked so hard and made so little money, but loved it. Texas is a dynamic, interesting place to work and a place to live. And the legislature was a wonderful place to work. So I love teaching this because I met so many people during that time that, people who were educated and good folks and everything had no idea how their state government works. And it is a dynamic, interesting, fascinating place to visit and to be. So we'll start off with this. Remember that Reconstruction Constitution, how we decided the current Constitution that we live under, we totally got rid of power being concentrated in one place. We totally got rid of this big government mentality that existed during the Reconstruction era. So much so that we created a part-time legislature. Our legislature is part-time. Now, people like me who work there, we work full-time. We work a lot, but the actual legislature itself only meets once every 2 years. And this is called a biennium. Bi meaning 2, ennium, year. So every 2 years. Biannual is twice a year. Biennium, once every 2 years. And how do we get all this stuff done? Well, it's a lot. There are a lot of committees and efforts that happen in that biennial period in between sessions. So we meet for 140 days, once every 2 years, in odd numbered years. Remember that. We're a part-time legislature that meets once every 2 years in odd numbered years for 140 days. Short amount of time. So how does this work? All right, so you have 2 chambers, and this is, normal throughout state government. Congress looks something like this. But we have 2 chambers. So we have the House of Representatives and the Senate. House districts are smaller. Okay, so it's easy to gain a House seat. You don't have to have a lot of money or a lot of experience or a big political machine behind you. It's around 100,000 people in a House district. So we have 150 House members. So when you look at the House, because it's easier to obtain a seat, it's more within reach. You've got young folks, old, gay, straight, disabled, black, white, all Asian, It's all kinds of people. The House truly looks like Texas. It truly looks like our population because those seats are attainable. There's this great story. It's a young man who just graduated from UT up in Central Texas in a little town called Dripping Springs. His name is Patrick Rose. He's still in the legislature, I believe, and he basically just went to football games and rode around in his pickup truck and went to Rotary Club meetings and just basically said, "Hey, here I am," and was the youngest House member at like 23. Really interesting story. They made a documentary about him. So a House seat is obtainable, and so that's a great place for a lot of ideas to come to fruition. A lot of viewpoints from 150 different districts, different communities of interest all across the state. So you want to remember that the House of Representatives elects its own leader. So it's primarily a partisan position. I mean, if you have more Democrats, you're going to have a Democrat speaker. If you have more Republicans, you'll have a Republican speaker. But they elect their own leader. And this is the person who kind of keeps the trains running on time, make sure this legislative process that we're going to be talking about in a few minutes actually works and that each bill is treated the same way. Okay, so now we're going to jump over to the Senate side. Why do we need a Senate? The Senate districts are larger, much larger. Like, for instance, the Senate district, the senator that I worked for, the district was about as big as the state of Louisiana. And I grew up in Louisiana. So lots of travel, lots of different constituencies, much more difficult to gain a Senate seat because you have to reach so many more people. There's only 31 senators. So all these ideas and all this diversity and all this raucous stuff that comes out of the House of Representatives eventually gets to the Senate, and that's where it sort of cools down, so because 31 people is a much easier group to deal with, but you aren't going to see the diversity in the Senate. Okay, the Senate is still mostly Anglo, still mostly male. Okay, and they're led by a statewide elected official, the lieutenant governor. A lot of people in Texas think the lieutenant governor is basically a spare governor. And that is true in a sense. I mean, if the governor cannot fulfill his duties, or like George W. Bush runs for president and wins, then the lieutenant governor ascends to that position. So in a sense, that's true. But in Texas, the lieutenant governor is a very powerful position because he or she is the leader of the Senate. And they also have that person who holds that office also has a lot of responsibility as that relates to where and how we spend our money. And if you have control of the money, then you are the one in power. So in many ways, our lieutenant governor is much more powerful than our governor. Okay. So the House of Representatives elects their own leader, the Speaker of the House. The lieutenant governor runs the Senate. Okay, so with the leadership, what does each one of these people do? What makes these positions important? Why would people want them? All right. Well, with the Speaker of the House controls the flow of legislation, all these public policy ideas. Should we spend money here? Or should we do this? Should we do that? The Speaker of the House basically controls that. Only a member of the legislature can file a bill that may become a law. That's what these proposals are called. They're called bills. So if you're a member of the House of Representatives, you can file your idea, your bill, in the House of Representatives. And the Speaker of the House and his or her staff will look at that and they'll say, does this idea have any merit? Does it have any support? Is this even something we need to do? Do I like this person? Are they a member of my party? And the Speaker kind of gets to decide if that piece of legislation is ever filed and moved into the process. Okay? The Speaker of the House also appoints committees. If you look at this specific portion of your textbook, you're going to see like a list of committees. And these are small groups of representatives who have been appointed by the Speaker of the House to sit on these specific committees that deal with specific public policy areas. You'll see the House Committee on Agriculture, the House Committee on Public Education, the House Committee on Higher Education. The list goes on. You don't have to know all of them, but you need to know that they're divided into public policy areas, areas that need a focus. And so this small group on these committees are really where most of the work on these legislative proposals is done. Because, you got 150 members in the House. Most of the work is done in these small committees where members have been appointed to these specific areas because they either have an interest or some expertise. And they can really drill down and say, well, what can we do to make this better? Do we like this? Do we want it to go any further in the process? Okay. So being on one of those committees is a really prime assignment for most legislators. And the Speaker of the House gets to decide who's on those committees. Okay. So now let's look at why would somebody want to be the lieutenant governor? A lot of the same reason. The lieutenant governor appoints the committees, controls the flow of legislation just like the Speaker does, but on the Senate side. So any senator can file a bill that may become a law. But before it's introduced to the chamber, to all 31 senators, the lieutenant governor and his or her staff is going to sit down and look at that legislative proposal and say, do we like this? Is this something we need to move on? Is there support for it? Do I like this person? Are they a member of my party? All those kinds of things come into play. And if the lieutenant governor and his or her staff decide, that particular proposal, that particular bill isn't going to make it very far, we don't have a lot of support for it, Texas doesn't need it, whatever, it never gets introduced to the chamber. So you have to understand there's a lot of power there as far as controlling the flow of ideas. The Senate has committees as well. They don't have as many as the House because they don't have as many members. And again, the Senate kind of acts as a cooling off place. 31 people are going to work easier together than 150. And then when you pare that down to even more, groups of 8, 10, 12, whatever, as that relates to the committee members, then they're going to be able to drill down on those public policy areas and really tweak them and figure out, do we need to change them? Do we need to throw it out? Whatever. But here's where the lieutenant governor has some real sway. The lieutenant governor chairs what we call the Legislative Budget Board. And we'll get more into how this works when we get to public finance. But for now, what you need to understand about the Legislative Budget Board is this is a group of representatives and senators. And the lieutenant governor is the chair. And the Speaker of the House is the vice chair. That means whatever happens with our state's budget, where are we going to spend money? Where are we going to cut? Are we going to cut funds for TSTC? Are we going to add funds for TSTC? Are we going to cut funds for public education? Are we going to add funds? This is the guy or gal who makes all those kind of first decisions. What do we like? The governor can weigh in and does, but it's ultimately that Legislative Budget Board, which the governor does not sit on, that ultimately decides what our budget for each biennium, each 2-year period, is going to look like. So that's where you see the lieutenant governor having some real behind the scenes sway as that relates to money. Okay. So here's another difference between the House and the Senate. Pay attention to this. House members serve 2-year terms at the state level, and state senators serve 4-year terms. Okay, so you can run for as many terms as you want. I know Senator Lucio from this area. I used to work as a television journalist for the ABC affiliate here in the Rio Grande Valley, and I covered Senator Eddie Lucio's first run for public office, and that was in 1990. And he's still in office. So as long as you have people in a majority of voters that are going to send you back to the Capitol, then there are no term limits. There's no term limits for governor. Governor Perry, I worked for Governor Perry. He became Secretary of Energy under President Trump. I worked for Governor Perry for a while after I left the legislature, and he, I think, still is I think he was designated the longest serving governor in Texas history. I think it was 15, 16 years. Ran for president twice during that time, and the majority of voters in Texas said, "Hey, we like this guy," kept sending him back. So there are no term limits. So know the difference. You don't need to know the age and citizenship or any of that stuff. But just know that with the House, they're running for office every 2 years. So it's kind of like a constant campaign. You see a lot of turnover and a lot of change in the House. With senators, with that 4-year term, you have a lot more time to carve out your niche, to bring something home to your district, to tell the voters in that district, here's what I did for you. Here's what I did for us. Here's how I'm helping make our community in Texas a better place. So you see a lot of longevity. You see a lot of people in the Senate who've been there for years. And again, as long as voters want to keep sending them back, that's how it works here. Okay. Now, how does a bill become a law? Remember, only a member of the Texas legislature can file a bill that may become a law. Okay. The governor can't. The lieutenant governor can't. The Speaker of the House could, because he or she is technically a member. Because remember, they elect one of their own. The Attorney General can't. The NRA can't. The Sierra Club can't. Only a member, an elected member of the Texas legislature. Where do they get these ideas? Well, they get them from us. We need to contact our elected officials and tell them what our priorities are. And we can do that through communicating via email, voice, calling, snail mail, or you can join a public interest group like the NRA if you're a gun enthusiast, or the Sierra Club if you're an environmentalist. But they listen to us. And that's where these ideas come from. What do my constituents, that's what we're called, if we're a member of a district, what do my constituents want? What are they telling me? Okay. And when I was in the legislature, I worked with people just like you for different types of action in the Texas legislature. One of my favorite ones is the Amber Alert bill. We worked on that, and now there's a statewide system that can notify us when a child's been kidnapped or if there's a dangerous situation that we need to be aware of. Those ideas come from people. Okay. All right. So how does that happen? A bill can be filed either in the House or the Senate. It can be filed, senators file bills, members of the House file bills, representatives file bills. Okay. And then if in the House, if the Speaker of the House says, hey, this is a good idea, it's read on the floor, and then it's referred to the appropriate committee. And remember, that's where the majority of this work gets done. If it gets voted out of committee on its first reading, then it goes to the floor. And that's when the 150 representatives over on the House side get to make amendments and changes, and they'll vote it out favorably, meaning they're all in support, or if it doesn't get a majority vote, it dies on the floor. And that's what it's called. A lot of bills die in committee, and they never get out of committee. It's very difficult for a bill to become a law. And so it basically goes through that process, about 3 times in the House, and then it goes over to the Senate. It's referred to the appropriate committee, and it goes through a similar process. So what is introduced over in the House as a bill, as you can imagine, looks very different as it goes through this process. Some of them that are easy and simple may not change very much. but there's always additions, deletions, as each representative, as each senator listens to their constituents, the ones who will talk to them, the ones who are active, and figures out how they can make this proposal better, or if they need to get rid of it altogether. Okay? So if a senator files a bill, the lieutenant governor looks at it and says, do we have any support for this? Is this a good idea? Or is this just a waste of our time? And if he or she thinks it's a good idea, then guess what? It's read on the floor and it's referred to the appropriate committee. And again, in those Senate committees, just like in the House, that's where a lot of the work is done on figuring out how do we make this a good proposal for the majority of the state. Texas is a very difficult state to govern because we're so diverse. We're a big state, but even within our state, we're very diverse. The issues and the challenges that my area here in Harlingen face are drastically different than Waco, the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It's a different population here. It's a majority Hispanic, lower income levels. When you look at Waco up, majority Anglo, higher income and higher education levels. Two different areas of the same state with very different priorities, and the same goes for East and West. So it's our size makes us cool, but it can make us very difficult to govern. So when you read the chapter on the legislature in your book, I want you to remember the structure of each chamber, who the leadership is of each chamber, what's different about the Senate than the House, just basic steps of how a bill becomes a law, that the legislative proposals have to go through both chambers. There are a lot of changes and additions and deletions, but that this is where Texans are represented. This is where laws are made. And if you don't have a relationship with your state senator and your state representative and their staff, you should try to build one, especially if you are going to open your own business, have a family, own a home, improve your community. So those are some highlights from chapter 7. When we get to chapter 8, this is where we talk about the plural executive, the executive branch. We've already touched on some of this, but if you go to the plural executive, I want you guys to know, what are the responsibilities of the governor? What are the responsibilities of the lieutenant governor, the attorney general? The attorney general is the state's chief law enforcement officer. This is who represents us when we fight against the federal government. And if we believe that a federal law or a federal action is unjust, this is who goes and represents us. This is who defends us when we've passed a law that the federal government doesn't believe is constitutional. Okay, so state's chief law enforcement officer. And then you have the General Land Office, the commissioner of the General Land Office. We have a lot of public land in Texas. It's a big job. You don't hear a lot. It's not a controversial job, more or less, but you'll want to read about what does the land commissioner do. The agriculture commissioner, remember, we were small farmers and ranchers for decades, if not centuries. We're moving away from a dominant agricultural-based economy, oil and gas as well, into a more urbanized economy, universities, research, tech, all those things. So we don't really hear as much about the agriculture commissioner as we used to. Where I live in the valley, agriculture is still a mainstay. It's still very important. This is who warns the farmers and ranchers of the state if there's a pesticide that's been deemed harmful, who protects our agricultural interest, who advertises our agricultural products to the nation and the world. And that's an elected official. The controller of public accounts, this is an interesting position. I didn't know a lot about the controller of public accounts, but in Texas, because we've divided everything up, we put the final say-so about how our money is spent, not deciding, but validating it. The state's chief accountant is the comptroller of public accounts. We have to have a balanced budget. Okay, that's something to remember. The way the Constitution of 1876 is written, we can't borrow money. We can't operate in the red, meaning, we can't spend more than we take in. We don't really have a credit card, I mean, most of us may have some form of credit, some way to get money if we're short. Texas doesn't really have that. All we bring in is all we have to spend. And so if we're not bringing in enough, then all we can do is cut back on our spending. And how do we ensure that what we're doing, where we're spending and where we're cutting, is constitutional as that relates to the Texas Constitution? Well, that's up to the Comptroller of Public Accounts. After the state's budget goes through its entire process, which we'll talk about in the chapter on public finance, the governor can sign off on the state's budget. It can be passed out of the Senate, out of the House, go through the whole process to the T. But it's not over yet. It has to go to the Comptroller of Public Accounts, and his or her staff goes through each expenditure, each cut, to make sure that our money is being spent the way it should be, and that we're not running in a deficit, meaning spending more than we take in, and to ensure that everything that was done in the legislative process to the state's budget evens out. And until the controller certifies the state's budget, that money can't be spent. When I was working in the Senate, we had a $28 billion budget shortfall one year. And this was in 2003. And we were all like, oh my God, it's lots of cuts. There's just no way around it. Lots of people are going to be losing services. Lots of schools aren't going to be getting new computers. I mean, it was rough. And we got through it, and we managed to, figure out how to find the money. And there were a lot of different financial mechanisms that were used in order to ensure that we balanced, that we were able to cut $28 billion out of spending. So it was signed by Governor Perry, who was governor at the time, and then it went to the Comptroller of Public Accounts to be certified. And it takes them about a week or so. And this staff of, public administration officials and accountants and CPAs and this and that, they go through all of it. And what the controller found was that there was a $5 billion error. And even though the governor had signed off on it, even though the Senate and the House had felt that they did everything that they could do and did it well, they found a $5 billion error. Therefore, the controller, her name was Carol Keaton Rylander Strayhorn, Comptroller Strayhorn. And she was like, I'm not certifying the budget. It's $5 billion off. And so guess what has to happen? A special session of the legislature is called. Now, the governor, and remember this, the governor is the only person who can call a special session of the legislature. Since we only meet for 140 days every 2 years, there are times when the state's business isn't finished, or there's a special item that needs to be dealt with that we didn't have time to deal with during the regular session. But budget is, always kind of an issue. And in this case, Governor Perry had to call the legislature back into special session to fix this $5 billion problem. So here's what you need to know about a special session. Only the governor can call one. They can last only 30 days, no more, but less if the business gets done. And the governor decides what types of bills can be heard. This is known as the call. What's on the call? So when that particular special session was convened, the call was the budget, fixing this $5 billion error. So let's say, the senator I worked for had a bill about, building an airport. Well, that couldn't even be introduced because the call was specifically about fixing this $5 billion gap in the budget. So, of course, any kind of bill that required new funds, that's not going to be on there. So the governor can decide what the areas of public policy are. And so that's the one big thing that the governor can do, and the governor can call as many special sessions as he or she wants. But if you look at the more day-to-day operations as far as money, administrative duties, that's really vested more in the lieutenant governor. Okay, so the controller is a little bit more interesting than you think. The Secretary of State is an appointed position, so that's usually a political position. The Secretary of State in a state government capacity is basically the office within the executive that handles all of the elections. And that's become more and more controversial in recent years. But this is where we go to have our elections certified, meaning, the count is over. It met all legal requirements. There was nothing funny going on. So, this is who administers the elections. This is where you register to vote. This is who maintains the voter records of the state. This is the office that ensures that when we go to vote, we're treated fairly, that we're not turned away from the polls because we're Black or a woman. That if we have the appropriate identification, there should be no reason why we shouldn't be able to vote. Now, we have to be registered, okay? And you can register to vote very easily at the Texas Secretary of State's website. And we'll get into that more. You have an extra credit assignment that's due at the end of the semester. If you are registered to vote, you'll get extra credit for that. If you are not registered to vote, you need to do so that you can participate and get your extra credit. So that's basically what the Secretary of State's office does. But it's a political appointment. The governor appoints the Secretary of State. So that's not the way it works in all states, but it's the way it works in a lot. And there are questions now because elections have become controversial as to whether or not that needs to be an elected position and not an appointed one. So we'll see. That might be a good thought question at some point. So you'll want to read about the plural executive, what each one of these folks does, so you'll know. So you'll know what part of governing the state each one of these individuals has. Chapter 9 is about the court system. The court system in Texas, you have two court systems in every state. You have a federal court system and you have a state court system. The federal court system, is the highest, being the Supreme Court. These handle federal issues, disputes between states, questions of civil rights or civil liberties, guns, freedom of speech, federal crimes, bank robbery, airport theft. Those usually are federal crimes. So your federal court handles those. And then you also have state courts. In Texas, the state court system is really kind of a hodgepodge of different levels. It's really kind of difficult to figure out where you go from one to another. But some basic differences in the court system is this. All of us, I think, are going to have an experience with our local court system. And so I think it's important for us to understand that you have a justice of the peace, which usually handles issues that happen within the county. That's that unincorporated area between cities. Then you have a municipal court. And a municipal court is basically the court for a city, municipality. It's a fancy word for a city, like a municipal golf course or a municipal auditorium. That's in service to that municipality, the city. So I live, say I live in Harlingen and I'm driving to San Antonio, and somewhere along the road I get a ticket, and I'm not, it's by a state trooper. So that happens within the county. So I have to go to the county court within the area that happened. Let's say I get all the way to San Antonio and I get a speeding ticket within San Antonio. I can't handle that in Harlingen, where I'm from. I have to handle that in San Antonio, where the ticket happened. That's in that municipal court. So most of us are going to have interaction with our local court system. The two highest levels of the Texas court system is your Court of Criminal Appeals. This is where the death sentence is handed out. We use that quite freely in Texas. So this is where your nastiest, most heinous crimes end up. And then we have a Supreme Court in Texas, a state Supreme Court, and not to be confused with the United States Supreme Court. Remember, two different systems. Our state Supreme Court mostly deals with juvenile issues and civil matters. Okay, a civil matter would be this. Civil matters are crimes between people. Okay, between people. And what do I mean by that? For example, if you go to a big store, a Target or a Walmart or H-E-B or something like that, and let's say you slip and fall, and you get hurt really badly, and the reason why you slipped and fell was because, and this was a real case, because somebody spilled a box of BBs on the floor and nobody ever cleaned it up. And when you stepped on them, your feet flew out from under you and you really messed up your back. You were unable to work. You were just not quite right after that. And you sue the store. That's a civil case. That's a crime between people, between entities. And so those are the kinds of things that end up in the state Supreme Court. You also want to remember that all of our judges in Texas are elected, which is, it has its good and its bad points. With our smaller courts, these are usually people who want to serve their community. They're dealing with, traffic tickets or non-payment of rent or, little smaller issues. But once you get up to the larger issues, you can run into some bias. And there's a good article in your book about that you might want to read. And it's not that judges in Texas are biased. It's that when you are elected, you're beholden to the community that you're supposed to sit in judgment of. I mean, you're reliant upon them for political contributions. You socialize at the country club or at the PTA meeting or the Little League game or wherever. So it's kind of an interesting thought question. A lot of states have judges that are appointed, and that kind of tends to take away a little bit of the bias. So interesting thought question there. So those are some of the things that you want to concentrate on for your chapter 9 on the judiciary. Then in chapter 10, we look at local government. Local government is one of the most impactful things on your day-to-day life. And we don't really see it that way. Local elections have a really low voter turnout rate, which this should be where we turn out the most. These are our friends and neighbors who are running for an office, for a position that can enhance our quality of life. Your city government is your mayor and your city council. These are the people that write grants to see if you can get a new gymnasium for the school or a bigger public library or a grant to improve the sewer system or wastewater management. And none of these things are sexy. None of these things are exciting. But if they went away, or if they weren't done, or if they were done halfway or not at all, your community would definitely suffer. Communities that don't have really good civic engagement, don't have really good city government, are the ones that tend to deteriorate. Their public schools aren't up to par. There's crime, bad roads, bad water. But when people start getting involved and they start working with their city governments, then neighborhoods tend to come back to life. County government is your county judge and your county commissioners. And your county government, this is what's responsible for if you live outside of a city, a municipality. Now, it's basically an incorporated area like Waco or Fort Bend or Abilene, Harlingen. Okay, so those are municipalities. But if you live out in the country, that's what we always call it, because I grew up out in the country. A lot of people think, well, there are no laws out there. That's the country. No, there are laws out there. That's where your sheriff's deputies are patrolling. That's where your state troopers patrol in municipalities and along the highways and byways. But your county government's also responsible for, wildlife management, roads and bridges, record keeping, surveying property. Make sure your property isn't being encroached upon. They're also, I had an interesting case with one of my students a couple of years ago, who lived out in the county and had people dumping garbage on their property. And I don't mean like a Whataburger wrapper. I mean like toilets and refrigerators and tires and things like that. And she's just like, well, I live in the country. We just have to deal with it. No, you don't. That's where your county judge and your county commissioners and your sheriff's office come into play. So just because you don't live in a city, it doesn't mean that there's not a level of government for you to engage in. It doesn't mean that you don't need to vote or keep track of who's running for office. These are the people that have a very direct impact on your day-to-day quality of life, the safety of your neighborhoods, the condition of your roads, the quality of your schools. Okay, so take a look at local government and look at it with kind of a new perspective. Okay, so that's a good rundown of what we have in Unit 3. So I know this is kind of a longer lecture, but go through the main points and concepts, rewatch if you need to, take notes, and focus on those specific pieces in the chapter that I mentioned. And you should be able to really engage well with your discussion questions and your written essay, and of course your quiz and your exam.